Good evening and welcome, everyone. My name is Katrine Smit, and I'm a philosopher and gender studies scholar affiliated to the Center for Contemporary European Philosophy here in Nijmegen. And I'll be just chairing the talk, the Q&A tonight. Very happy to welcome Professor Amy Allen here, who is a professor of philosophy at Penn State University in the United States. She works on critical theory and feminist theory, and she'll be talking, the title for today's event is Decolonizing Our Ideas, and that's kind of based on her last book, The End of Progress, Decolonizing Critical Theory. So I'm very happy to that she's here tonight, and I would like you to join me in welcoming her for her talk. So the floor is yours, Amy.
Wow, this is such an impressive room. I feel a little overwhelmed. So thank you, Katrina, for the introduction, and I also want to thank Anya Topolsky and her colleagues here for the invitation to present this lecture tonight. So as Katrina just mentioned, I have a recent book, the title of which is The End of Progress. The subtitle is actually slightly longer and somewhat different than what she said. It's Decolonizing the Normative Foundations of Critical Theory. And I mention that because the sense in which I use the term decolonizing is fairly specific and I think somewhat limited because it's really a focus on the role that the idea of progress and related concepts like social evolution and historical learning and so on play in buttressing the normative perspective of contemporary Frankfurt School critical theory, so Habermasian and post-Habermasian critical theory. So that's just to give some kind of basic sense of the orientation of the project. Okay, so my talk for this evening is based on the book that I recently published under the title The End of Progress. The title for the book was inspired by a line from Theodor Adorno, one of the towering figures of the first generation of the Frankfurt School of Critical Social Theory, who claimed in his lectures on history and freedom that progress occurs only where it comes to an end. Now, for Adorno, this meant a number of things, but at least one of the meanings of this phrase was that the possibility of progress in the future only opens up in the wake of a process of technological development that has been made possible through Enlightenment rationality. A process that is typically understood as straightforwardly progressive, that is Enlightenment rationality, but that Adorno thinks is anything but. For Adorno, although the trajectory from the slingshot to the megaton bomb may constitute progress in a technological sense, this trajectory has also given rise to the horrors of the 20th century and brought humanity to the brink of destruction. And yet, perhaps paradoxically, that very same process, which we should, on his view, at least now hesitate to call progress, has at the same time created the technological conditions under which we could now, for the first time, imagine alleviating material suffering and want on a global scale. Thus, although for Adorno there can be no sense in which it makes sense to read history as a story of progress, progress is still possible for us now. And part of what that would entail is the very constitution of a universal humanity in the first place. Now, Adorno's particular concerns with claims to progress are somewhat different from mine. His concerns have primarily to do with the horror of the Holocaust and the threat of nuclear war. And yet, I'm nonetheless in fundamental sympathy with what I take to be the core animating idea of his proposal. Namely, that jettisoning false ideological readings of history as a story of progress is necessary if we are to be able to make moral or political progress in the future. In other words, the key idea that I want to take from Adorno is to attempt to decouple claims about the possibility of progress in the future from readings of history as a story of progress. As I see it, this way of thinking about progress provides an important corrective to the role that progress plays in contemporary Frankfurt School critical theory, which tends to adopt a broadly speaking neo-Hegelian strategy for thinking about normativity, and in so doing, roots its vision of progress as a moral or political imperative in a claim about historical progress, or a reading of history as a story of progress. This strategy, which is, I think, exemplified in the work of Habermas, but also of post-Habermasian critical theorists such as Axel Honneth, is motivated by the thought, inspired by Marx, that the possibility of progress in the future must be grounded in actually existing historical potentials and developments in order to avoid abstract or bad utopianism. Now, although I share the concern with avoiding bad utopianism, I think that this strategy for grounding critical theory in a reading of history as progress is vulnerable to both conceptual and political objections, objections that come together in a particularly powerful form in post- and decolonial theory, which has exposed the link between theories of progress and ideologies of colonialism and imperialism. Now, although I would not go quite so far as to say that critical theory is to blame for Western philosophy's more widespread silence on issues of colonialism and imperialism, I do believe that critical theory has a special responsibility to attempt to confront this issue. If, following Nancy Fraser, who was in turn following Marx, we understand critical theory as the self-clarification of the struggles and wishes of the age, then critical theory very much needs to engage in a dialogue with those theories that have emerged out of the waves of decolonization that have radically transformed the global political landscape in the last 75 years, and that continue to profoundly shape our political present. Moreover, if, as I would like to suggest, critical theory's strategy for linking progress in the future to a reading of history as progress ends up implicating critical theory in neo-colonial and neo-imperial ideologies, then this should very much be a matter of concern for a theory that strives to be self-reflexive about its own situatedness in existing relations of power and oppression. As Max Horkheimer argued in his programmatic essay, Traditional and Critical Theory, the difference between these two approaches, traditional theory and critical theory, is a difference not so much of objects, but rather of subjects. Both traditional and critical theory take society as their object of study, but the critical theorist, unlike the traditional theorist, understands herself and her theory as situated within the very relations of oppression and reification that she aims to critique. Thus, critical theory, in its very methodology, one might say, or in its very structure, puts the subject position of the critic at stake. So if critical theory aims to criticize not only capitalism, which was, of course, Horkheimer's primary focus, but also all of those relations of oppression that are salient in contemporary societies such as ours, then this must include a self-reflexive understanding of our own situatedness in relation to the ongoing legacies of colonialism and imperialism. So I hope these opening remarks give you some idea about the motivation for the book, or why I wrote it. For the remainder of my talk, I'd like to say a bit more about the concept of progress, what it does and doesn't mean, what role the idea of historical progress plays in contemporary critical theory, and why that role is problematic. And toward the end of the talk, I'll spend a little bit of time sketching out an alternative way of thinking about the relationship between history and normativity that does not rely on the notion of progress, even as it seeks to hold open the possibility of progress in the future. Okay. So let me start with the concept of progress. One can talk about progress with respect to many different goals or benchmarks. Given any particular goal or aim that I might have, I can understand myself as getting closer to or further away from attaining it. In that sense, I can talk about making progress in my training for a marathon or in finishing my book manuscript. And all that I need to make sense of such claims is a clear sense of the standard by means of which progress is being measured. Now, the traditional discourse of historical progress, as it emerged in the European Enlightenment tradition, tended to make a much broader claim about the overall advancement of humankind from some primitive or barbaric condition to a more developed, advanced, enlightened, or civilized state. As the German intellectual historian Reinhard Koselleck reminds us, the term progress, as it was used in the Enlightenment tradition, quote, neatly and deftly brought the manifold of scientific, technological, and industrial meanings of progress, and finally also those meanings involving social morality and even the totality of history under a common concept, end quote. So traditional notions of progress, historical progress, thus depend on a robust metaphysical idea of the totality of history, and at least posit a point of view from which this totality can be comprehended. So I'd like to make it clear from the outset that my critique of progress does not in any way concern the concept of progress per se. My point is not that the concept itself is problematic, nor do I claim that there are no local or specific instances of progress. Thus, it wouldn't really be an objection to my argument to point out that there has been progress in some specific domain or another. Once one has established a normative benchmark or standard, as I already said, it seems to me it's relatively straightforward to make a case for local or specific instances of either progress or regress. And in that sense, that very abstract sense, I have no objection to the concept of progress. Rather, the critique is aimed at the much broader and more ambitious claim that history can be understood as a progressive development from some so-called primitive or barbaric condition to a more developed, rational, enlightened, or civilized state. So to preview the argument that I want to develop in the rest of the talk, it's this idea, or at least a recognizable vestige of this idea, that continues to play a crucial, if often unacknowledged, role in grounding the normative perspective of contemporary critical theory. And it's also this idea that is deeply entangled with the ideologies of colonialism and imperialism. So I'll say more about contemporary critical theory in a minute, but first, by way of contrast, it's worth noting that first-generation critical theorists of the Frankfurt School, especially Walter Benjamin and also Theodor Adorno, were famously extremely skeptical of the discourse of historical progress. In his 9th thesis on the philosophy of history, Benjamin depicts what we call progress as merely an ongoing catastrophe, hurling wreckage at the feet of the angel of history. Similarly, in his lectures on the philosophy of history, Adorno notes that the catastrophe of Auschwitz, quote, makes all talk of progress towards freedom seem ludicrous, end quote, and makes the affirmative mentality that engages in such talk look like, quote, the mere assertion of a mind that is incapable of looking horror in the face and that thereby perpetuates it, end quote. Now, in their skepticism toward the discourse of progress, Benjamin and Adorno were joined by two other major political thinkers of the 20th century, both of whom I think deserve to be called critical theorists in the broader sense of that term, Hannah Arendt and Michel Foucault. These theoretical critiques of progress, which tended to focus on the highly metaphysical nature of the philosophy of history that undergirded such claims, dovetailed with a more political critique of progress in the work of anti-colonial theorists such as Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, and others, which uncovered the highly ideological role that claims about progress and development have played in justifying projects of imperialism and colonialism. Indeed, the chorus of voices critiquing the idea of progress throughout the 20th century has been so strong that one might think that the concept had been relegated to the dustbin of history. And yet the idea of progress has quietly made a comeback in Frankfurt School critical theory. Starting with Jürgen Habermas, critical theorists have reformulated the concept of progress in a more post-metaphysical, deflationary, differentiated, and pragmatic vein in an effort to detach it from the traditional philosophy of history in which it was previously embedded. And in some cases, they have also attempted to respond to the political critique of progress as inherently Eurocentric or imperialistic. And I'm thinking somewhat of Habermas's work on the concept of multiple modernities and also of Tom McCarthy's book, Race, Empire, and the Idea of Human Development. I don't find these responses convincing myself, but I'm not going to talk about them in the talk. I'm happy to say more in the discussion if people would like. These more recent reformulations of this ambitious notion of historical progress are much less metaphysically loaded and much more internally differentiated than the version found in traditional Enlightenment philosophies of history. So although some defenders of the notion of progress still want to defend the idea that there has been demonstrable progress not only in technological or scientific, but also in moral political domains, they nonetheless view these as disaggregated phenomena. So for Habermas, who defends this broad conception of progress, for example, there's no reason to think that technical or scientific progress should lead to moral political progress or vice versa, much less that either of those things would lead to human happiness. And even if we think within the moral political domain, economic progress may not be accompanied by moral progress or cultural progress and so on. That's what I mean by disaggregated. And in all domains, Habermas understands progress, which he tends to refer to using terms such as social evolution, learning processes, or simply rationalization or an increase in rationalization, in a post-metaphysical vein as a contingent historical achievement, the result of human agency, thus subject to reversals and regressions. Still, the reading of European modernity as a progressive story of social evolution, historical development, and learning plays a crucial, if often unacknowledged, role in Habermasian and post-Habermasian critical theory. Now, as I've already suggested, this embrace of the concept of progress sets contemporary critical theory apart from the perspective of the first generation of Frankfurt School thinkers. Indeed, although such a reading would admittedly be partial, it would not be wholly misleading to write the history of Habermas's break with the methodology of first-generation critical theory in terms of their radically opposed understandings of progress. According to that version of the story, Habermas is, as he once insisted, the last Marxist standing in the Frankfurt School camp. In the very specific sense, I mean, this doesn't have anything to do with the critique of capitalism, really, but what he means by calling himself the last Marxist is that he holds on to the historical materialist view that our hope for progress in the future, in order to count as genuine hope, must be grounded in the objective tendencies of the present, which is to say, on some account of historical progress or progressive developments that could be extended. However non-metaphysical, pragmatic, and deflationary that account of progress is for Habermas, it certainly stands in stark contrast to Benjamin and Adorno's straightforward rejection of this tenet of Marxist historical materialism. As Adorno put it with characteristic bluntness, quote, "There is no basis for hope in the objective historical trend," end quote. Now, the recent reformulations of the concept of progress are motivated, at least in part, by the thought that critical theory in some way crucially depends on the idea of progress. That is, that one cannot be a critical theorist without being committed to some understanding of progress. Two distinct kinds of arguments have been offered for the claim that critical theory needs an idea of progress in order to be genuinely critical. The first argument is that we need the idea of progress towards some goal in order to give us something to strive for politically, in order to make our politics genuinely progressive. Progress understood in this sense is connected to Kant's famous third question, what may I hope for? In order for a theory to be critical, or so this argument goes, it must be connected to the hope for some significantly better, more just, or perhaps just less oppressive society. Such hopes serve to orient our political strivings, and in order to count as genuine hopes, like rational hope as opposed to just mere hope, they must be grounded in a belief in the possibility of progress. One could run this as a kind of transcendental argument. Whenever a theorist is critical of some existing feature of the social world, she must necessarily be presupposing an ideal in light of which she makes that criticism, and thus must further be committed to the claim that achievement of that ideal would constitute some sort of progress, normative progress, moral progress, political progress, something like that. The second reason that critical theory is thought to rely on an idea of progress involves a distinct but related kind of transcendental argument. The idea here is that insofar as critical theorists celebrate certain political events in their own time, and here Kant's stance on the French Revolution is taken as exemplary, they necessarily commit themselves to viewing those events as better than what came before, and in so doing commit themselves, at least implicitly, to the idea that certain features of their social and political world are the result of a progressive developmental or historical learning process. Now, these two arguments are often closely intertwined in ways that I'll discuss in a moment. But for now, I want to highlight that there are two distinct conceptions of progress implicit in these arguments. The first conception is forward-looking, oriented toward the future. From this perspective, progress is a moral political imperative, a normative goal that we are striving to achieve, a goal that could be captured under the idea of the good society, or maybe just the more just or the less oppressive society. The second conception is backward-looking, oriented toward the past. From this perspective, progress is a judgment about the developmental process that has led up to us, to our society or our form of life. A judgment that views the conception of reason, moral political institutions, social practices, and so on that make up our form of life as the result of a process of sociocultural development or historical learning. Now, I call the forward-looking conception of progress as an imperative, and the backward-looking one, progress as a fact. And fact is in scare quotes there because this is kind of obviously not an empirical judgment exclusively, but also a normative one. But the term progress as a fact is something that I take from Tom McCarthy's book, Race, Empire, and the Idea of Human Development, where he talks about the facts of global modernity, and that's connected to this reading of modernity as progress. So that's where that notion comes from. Both of these conceptions of progress, both the forward-looking and the backward-looking one, are obviously deeply bound up with claims about the possibility of articulating standards or principles or criteria that might enable trans-historical normative judgments. And in that sense, these two conceptions of progress do converge. Nevertheless, I'm going to try to pull them apart with the help of Adorno. Moreover, both of the arguments for why critical theory needs a conception of progress focus on the possibility of a specific kind of progress, namely what I'm calling moral political progress or normative progress, rather than on technical scientific progress or progress overall. So my focus then is going to be on this rather restricted notion of progress, moral political progress or normative progress. And I think we could have a whole conversation about to what extent those two, that conception of progress can be separated from technological or scientific progress. I think that's a very complicated question, but I'm going to set aside questions of technological or scientific progress for the remainder of the talk. Okay. So I'm moving on to a section of the talk where I focus on the role that these ideas of progress play in undergirding the normative perspective of contemporary critical theory. So in much work in recent critical theory, what I'm calling the backward-looking conception of progress as a fact plays a crucial, if often unacknowledged, role in grounding the normative perspective or standards of critical theory, and thus in justifying notions of progress as an imperative, or the forward-looking conception. As I see it, this follows more or less directly from the combination of two commitments. First, a commitment to the idea that the normative principles that enable critical theory to engage in a critique of contemporary society must be grounded immanently, that is, within the very same social world that is also the target of critique. And second, a commitment to the desire to avoid the slide into relativism. So these two commitments are, I think it's fair to say, in some tension with one another, inasmuch as the resolution to ground the normative perspective of critical theory within the existing social world perhaps inevitably raises worries about conventionalism or some form of cultural relativism, maybe. After all, if our normative or critical principles or framework are grounded immanently within the existing social world, then how can we claim that those principles or that framework is anything other than how we happen to do things around here? So the broadly speaking, what I would call left Hegelian strategy of grounding our normative or critical principles or framework in a progressive reading of historical or social development or evolution, favored by Jürgen Habermas and also by Axel Honneth, constitutes an attempt to resolve this tension. The basic idea is that the normative principles that we find within our existing social world, as they would say, as inheritors of the project of European Enlightenment or the legacy of European modernity, which has a certain conception of rational autonomy, as Habermas might say, or social freedom, as Honneth might say, at its core, These principles are themselves justified, at least in part, insofar as they can be understood as the outcome of a process of progressive social evolution or historical learning. Thus, this conception of historical progress enables critical theory to understand its normative standards as grounded in the existing social world without being merely contingent or arbitrary. Rather, those standards are justified as they can be reconstructed as the result of a process of historical development or social evolution. But if critical theory's immanent grounding of normative principles within the social world ultimately rests on a claim about social evolution or sociocultural learning processes, then this means that the normative standards that enable us to envision a good or more just society, so for Habermas that would be something like the discourse principle, and for Honneth something like the idea of social freedom, these ideas are themselves justified inasmuch as they are the outcome of a process of sociocultural development or learning. So in other words, the two conceptions of progress that I tried to delineate above are related in this account in that progress as a moral political imperative is grounded in or undergirded by progress as a historical fact. The normative perspective that serves to orient the forward-looking conception of progress is justified by a backward-looking historical story about how our modern European Enlightenment moral vocabulary and political ideals are the outcome of a learning process and therefore neither merely conventional nor grounded in some a priori transcendental conception of pure reason. So this suggests that at least insofar as the idea of progress is used in Habermas and Honneth's work, these two conceptions, the forward-looking notion of progress as an imperative and the backward-looking idea of progress as a fact, cannot be easily pulled apart. So that means, I think, that contemporary critical theory, as Habermas and Honneth conceive it, could only be disentangled from its commitment to progress by also rethinking its understanding of normativity. Okay, but why think that such a disentangling is necessary? I mean, what, after all, is problematic about what I have called the conception of progress as a fact, and by extension, the role that this conception plays in justifying the normative perspective of contemporary critical theory? So as I've already indicated, two sorts of objections are particularly salient here. The first is more conceptual, and the second is more political. The conceptual objection turns on the following sort of question. On what basis do we claim to know what counts as progress in our readings of history? Does a judgment about normative progress not presume some knowledge of what counts as the endpoint or goal of the historical development? And in that sense, don't all judgments about normative progress either presuppose some independent, non-historical, context-transcendent standard, or else collapse into the very conventionalism that they seek to avoid? So the worry here is that without such an independent standard, judgments about normative progress become, as Charles Larmor has put it, quote, irredeemably parochial, not much more than an instrument of self-congratulation, end quote. I should mention too, because I like that quote a lot, but Larmor then goes on to defend the idea of progress, so I think he would maybe not agree with the use to which I put him in my argument. But in any case, I think that way of presenting the problem, this idea of progress as an instrument of self-congratulation, is really helpful. So the political objection concerns the entwinement of the idea of progress as a fact with the legacies of racism, colonialism, and imperialism, and their contemporary, either informally imperialist or neo-colonial, or if you want to think about settler colonialism in North America, ongoingly colonial forms, and of course settler colonialism in other contexts as well. The idea that the normative ideals of the European Enlightenment are the result of a progressive developmental learning process by means of which modernity emerged out of traditional forms of life is, I think, completely entangled with the Eurocentric logic that justified colonialism and the so-called civilizing mission. As James Tully has pithily put the point, the language of progress and development is the language of oppression for 2/3 of the world's people. In other words, the notion of historical progress as a fact is bound up with complex relations of domination, exclusion, and silencing of colonized and subaltern subjects. So here I want to note once again that the objection here is not so much, at least as I as I want to take it up, to the concept of progress per se, but much more specifically to the claim that history can be read as a story of progress leading from some less developed, less rational, pre-modern state to the more civilized, rational, and developed state of European Enlightenment. In other words, the problem arises from reading the history of European modernity as a story of progress. And it is this history that's inextricably bound up with, in the sense that it both emerged out of and in turn served to justify the so-called civilizing mission of European colonialism. Now, it's possible to imagine these two objections coming apart or being articulated separately. For instance, I think one could share the worry about the self-congratulatory and potentially circular nature of reading history as progress without necessarily endorsing the more political objection about the entanglement of modernity as progress narratives in the logics of imperialism and colonialism. However, I tend to think that these two objections fit together quite well, and in fact, the second objection could be viewed as a further specification of the first. That is, it could be seen to be pointing out the particular form of self-congratulation endemic to European conceptions of modernity as progress. Indeed, the two sorts of objections can and often do come together, particularly in some of the post-colonial critiques of progress that take their cue from Foucault and the idea of the intertwining of power and knowledge. Okay. So in light of these objections, I want to argue for a different way of disentangling progress as a moral political imperative from progress as a fact. This strategy is inspired both by Adorno's thought, as I said at the outset, that progress occurs only where it ends, but also more generally by his attempt to develop a philosophy of history that is neither progressive nor a conservative, regressive Verfallsgeschichte, but is instead more deeply and thoroughly ambivalent. As I understand it, the point of this resolutely ambivalent reading of history is to problematize our own point of view. So neither to vindicate our historical development or to subvert it, but rather to problematize it, thus to open it up to critical scrutiny. So this ambivalent, internally contradictory, negative dialectical understanding of history underlies Adorno's dictum that progress occurs only where it ends. As I understand it, this means that dismantling and weaning ourselves off of ideological and problematic readings of history as progress is a condition of possibility for making progress in the future. But what would progress be on this view? Progress in the future, or the kind of conception that I would want to try to hang on to. Well, as is his way, Adorno does not say that much by way of offering a positive or constructive vision of what progress might look like in the future. One thing he does say is that progress for us now would mean simply the avoidance of catastrophe. This negativistic conception of progress is, I think, fruitful. So rather than articulating a positive utopian vision of the good society that we should strive to achieve, Adorno suggests that we would be better off if we could only avoid the worst. Adorno's chastened and sober view of progress seems particularly well suited to a historical moment in which catastrophe, particularly but not limited to ecological catastrophe, seems to loom around every corner. And yet this isn't all that Adorno says about what progress in the future might look like. Although he claims that we have no basis for claiming that there has been progress up to now, he insists, and this is something that sets him apart from Benjamin, that we can and indeed must continue to hope for the possibility of progress in the future. Indeed, to give up on this hope is to wallow in a pessimistic despair that Adorno associates with conservatism, and ultimately on his reading with Heidegger, although his reading of Heidegger is very tendentious. For Adorno to say something like, because there has been no progress up to now, there will be none in the future, is a fallacy that, as he says, quote, elevates historical despair into a norm that must be adhered to, and thereby takes up sides with everything that is dreadful, end quote. For Adorno, progress refers to the notion of a fulfilled humanity. And at least one reason that there has been no progress up to now is that the concept of universal humanity has thus far not been realized. Tragically, gone unrealized, you might say. As he puts it, quote, "No progress may be supposed that implies that humanity already existed and could therefore be assumed to continue to progress. Rather, progress would be the establishment of humanity in the first place." So two different kind of glimpses at what progress might mean. One is that it's the avoidance of catastrophe, and the other is that it's something like the establishment of a humanity that has up to now not yet existed. Now, again, although it's clear that Adorno does not root his claim that humanity has not yet begun to exist in a historical analysis of colonial racism, I mean, that's a serious lacuna in Adorno's thought, to be sure. I think that his call for the development of a universal humanity nonetheless resonates quite strongly with Achille Mbembe's call for the establishment of a politics of humanity in the wake of his critique of colonialism's dehumanizing logics in his recent book, Critique of Black Reason. And this is the thought that I'll end with. So Mbembe calls for a reimagining of the politics of universality, of humanity, and of the in common that is nonetheless grounded in a deep and deeply historical understanding of difference, of singularity, and of plurality, and of the history of domination, colonial domination and slavery. As he puts it, quote, "What we must imagine is a politics of humanity that is fundamentally a politics of the similar, but in a context in which what we all share from the beginning is difference. It is our differences that, paradoxically, we must share," end quote. As I see it, Mbembe and Adorno can both be understood as holding on to the idea of progress as a forward-looking imperative, a plea for justice, of humanity, and the project of the universal, that is nevertheless grounded in a sober reading of history that takes extremely seriously the ways in which the narrative of historical progress has been thoroughly entangled with the logic of colonial and imperial domination. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. Let's take a seat over there. Yeah. So, now we have time for a discussion, and I will start with asking maybe two questions to Amy, and then I will open it up to the audience. And when we do that, I think it would be very good to also have some light in the audience.
Yeah.
So that's
it's hard to see people.
Also because, yeah, we cannot see anyone now. Yeah, first of all, I want to really thank you for this very rich talk. You gave us a lot, I think. But to start the discussion, maybe it would be good also for this public lecture to say a little bit about the contours of critical theory as a discipline, because I think you spoke about critical theory in a narrow sense, but also maybe in a more expansive sense, and a kind of critical theory that has that is an inheritor of enlightenment. So what exactly is this critical theory? You also, I think, made a distinction between critical theory and traditional theory, and what is that distinction for you?
Well, maybe I'll start with the first question. Max Horkheimer, he had this programmatic essay that I think many people take to be one of the kind of seminal programmatic essays for critical social theory, with the title "Critical and Traditional and Critical Theory." Sorry, and so Horkheimer introduces that distinction. Critical theory for him is a sort of variant of Marxism, but it's a version of Marxism that attempts to offer a critique of modern Western capitalist societies that pays attention not only to their economic structure, but also to social institutions and cultural forms and so on. So one kind of way in which critical theory is different from traditional theory is in its kind of perspective or take on contemporary society. I mean, it thinks, on the classical Marxist version, it thinks modern society is capitalist and therefore alienating and reifying and also oppressive, and is something that should be critiqued and resisted and, transformed. So part of it has to do with the kind of critical orientation toward society. Part of it has also to do with methodology. So I mentioned this quote, which I think is quite nice, where Horkheimer says, critical theory is a difference primarily not of objects, but of subjects. So he's responding to traditional theories. I mean, I think he has in mind actually primarily more like traditional social science, that in a sort of positivistic way seeks to understand but not to take up a critical perspective on existing society. And that's all understood in terms of this idea of like the situatedness of the critic within the society that he or she aims to critique. Traditional theory sort of it tends to understand. It's sort of like more mainstream conceptions of work in the social sciences that would say, okay, what we're doing is trying to uncover law-like generalities that give us some understanding and predictive power over how social action happens and how it unfolds. And Horkheimer's claim is that, because of the fact that the theorist who is doing social theory is always also a member of the social world that they're trying to understand, one has to kind of reflect on that very situatedness. And traditional theory methodologically doesn't do that, right? It sort of it aspires to a more objective kind of understanding of society. So that's the part about the situatedness of the critical theorist. And I think, that's quite important methodologically, but in Horkheimer's essay, he really only understands that in terms of the framework of capitalism. So capitalism is a sort of overarching critical frame, and we have to understand ourselves as situated in the capitalist society that we're striving to criticize. And I think, one of the things I've been interested in my work is to think very carefully about that idea of situatedness, but in a much more complicated and intersectional understanding of power and oppression, right? So it's not just capitalism, but it's also its relations of gender oppression and racial oppression and heteronormativity and so on that are all structuring the social world that we aim to critique. And so we have to be kind of reflexive about our positioning in that whole complicated intersectional structure of power if we're going to follow the methodological imperative that Horkheimer lays down. So that's what I would say about traditional and critical theory. I mean, in terms of critical theory and like meanings of that term, there are narrower and wider ways of using that term, certainly. Sometimes people will use it just to refer to the Frankfurt School tradition. I mean, it's not a term that the Frankfurt School tradition owns by any means, but it is a sort of common thread of how they kind of understood what they were doing. And I guess in terms of my own, the way I would place myself in relationship to the term, I would say I am sort of coming out of that tradition of critical social theory in the Frankfurt sense, but part of the impulse of this project in particular, this book in particular, has been to try to open up a conversation between that tradition of critical social theory and a kind of broader, more capacious sense of critical theories, in which I would include a lot of work in feminist and gender studies and queer theory and post and decolonial theory. I mean, I think those are also critical theories that share the same impulse of critiquing existing society, also cultural forms. I mean, there's different ways of going about it. And I have not so much been in conversation with the Frankfurt School project. And I guess part of the reason for that, I think, at least this is one of the thoughts that motivated this book project, is that the idea of progress and the role that it plays in contemporary Frankfurt School critical theory has been a real stumbling block to those conversations, because that concept has been so thoroughly and I think rightly criticized, primarily in post and decolonial theory, but also in a lot of work in feminist and queer theory that is inspired by that body of work.
Yeah. Yeah, because when you gave that definition of critical theory as critiquing society and as taking the reflexivity of the critic in that, that kind of definition could also apply to feminist theory or queer theory or post-colonial theory, right?
Yes.
But you're also saying they are not so much in dialogue with each other yet somehow, or there is a bridging to happen there.
I share this sort of idea that, like, this idea or even the kind of Marxist idea, the self-clarification of the struggles and wishes of the age. I mean, I think that's an interesting way to understand a lot of different critical projects. But in terms of the way that, I don't know, the literature of kind of Frankfurt School critical theory, at least the versions that are really following the lead of Habermas, I don't think that there's been that much engagement with, particularly with post-colonial theory. I mean, there's been some, and as I mentioned in my talk, Habermas does himself try to respond to some of the worries which come up over and over again about his view being Eurocentric. I mean, it's not as if he doesn't know that this is an objection to his view. He discusses it actually repeatedly. But his attempt to sort of respond is to embrace the language of multiple modernities. And I think a lot of, I think that idea doesn't go far enough. And I think one of the reasons that he can't and doesn't go further is that he really needs the idea of modernity. It does a lot of normative work for him. And so part of what I wanted to do in the book was expose what, it's not like he's just happens to be a fan of the concept of progress or something like that. It's like he needs that idea. It's underpinning the whole normative edifice, at least as I read his project. And so therefore he feels like he can't give it up. And part of my sort of strategy in the book is to say, no, we should, and we can give it up, and we can draw on other resources in the Frankfurt School tradition, particularly Adorno is prominent in my discussion, that aren't committed to this idea of progress and yet, can help us think about, some other way of addressing the question of normativity. Yeah,
thanks. Maybe a question, maybe a question about how does this project of thinking critically about progress within critical theory and within Western philosophy, how does it relate to societal or political concerns, right? Because you use this term decolonizing, these normative foundations of critical theory. And of course, decolonization is also a term coming from political struggles around settler colonialism and all these inheritances of colonialism. So how do you see the relation between this intellectual project and political project or social projects of...
I think, and this is why I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the kind of restricted, narrow sense in which I use the term decolonizing in the book. I mean, because it is pretty abstract, and in other words, it's focusing on the trying to uncover and then and expose and then move beyond the role that the idea of progress plays in securing the normative foundations of critical theory. So it's not actually, as ambitious of a project as like attempting to decolonize critical theory per se or something like that, or to develop a decolonial critical theory. I mean, not because I don't think either of those projects would be good or valuable things to do, but just because my focus is really much more narrow and limited. That said, I do think the question of normative foundations is one that has been very front and center in critical theory for at least the last, 30, 35 years. I mean, it's been a big issue that critical theorists have been debating, and I think it's an important one, and also an interesting set of issues kind of in its own right, but it's very focused in a way. So how does it relate to political struggles? I mean, I think that, what I said at the beginning of the talk is, I guess, part of what I would say there. I mean, I think critical theory has, my understanding of it is this idea of the self-clarification of the struggles and wishes of the age, and so it has to, in some way, kind of remain connected to the kinds of concerns that emerge out of those political struggles. So I don't know that it has a direct, translation into political practice, but it is motivated by a set of concerns that emerges out of a particular set of political struggles. And then I think this sort of second point would be, it's related to the point about the situatedness of the critical theorist, I think, is that even understanding one's own situatedness in relationships of domination and privilege is itself, I think, a political act. I don't think it solves all the problems, but I do think it is an important, I don't think it's a substitute for, broader political struggles, but I think it can be an important moment in relationship to those struggles.
Yeah.